you for coming. Thank you for, hopefully you guys walk away with some really great information. Do we need the microphone? Can y'all hear me back there? Okay. So, a little louder. All right, is this better? All right. So, I'm Sam Murphy, and I'm a PhD candidate at LSU Health Sciences Shreveport in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology. And tonight we're going to talk about something that's an obsession of mine, which is Mars. And we're going to focus on some of the reasons why Mars has been making headlines lately. So this is the outline for the talk tonight. I hope you speak Martian. No, just kidding. All right, so tonight's mission is to learn about some of the goals of the past and current Mars exploration program. We're also going to answer the question, what did they find under the Mars ice cap, as well as what kind of life could be or could have been present on Mars. So the Mars exploration program has been around for about 30 years, and this is the group that's behind the majority of the discoveries, the things that we know about Mars today. And their major goal has always been to follow the water. The reason being that water equals life, at least it does on Earth. And so they've been trying to see if Mars has had the presence of water or has water at this time. But some of the other goals you may not be aware of include seeking habitable environments. And what that means is not necessarily just for the sake of finding life on Mars, but also for possibly putting a man on Mars for further exploration and discovery. So another interesting thing about why we're exploring Mars at this time is because we're also interested in possibly finding more resources on Mars for the future. So pop quiz, which dried up river delta is located on Mars? The one on the left or the one on the right? Anybody? All right, Benjamin, that's my son. Left or right, man? If you're guessing the left, that one's correct. But thank you, Ben, for your answer. But the point I'm just trying to make here is that there are many surface features on Mars that are very similar to features on Earth that suggest that there was water there in the past. So I'm going to take us back to December 2013. We're going to go to Mars to the Gale Crater. And the Gale Crater is a very prominent feature. It's about 96 miles wide. And here is actually the landing site of the Mars Curiosity rover. And what this little guy has been doing, he's been sort of sampling the soil and the air on Mars. And some interesting findings came from looking at the Gale Crater. Now, I just want to point out that in the center of the Gale Crater is this feature called Mount Sharp, which is 3 miles high. So these features on Mars aren't small, and they're pretty prominent. But what the Mars Curiosity rover found was fluctuating levels of methane in the atmosphere. He found organic chemicals in the soil, and he also found evidence that suggests that it once contained lakes and streams. But why is this exciting? Well, there are several basic requirements of life, which include organic chemicals, so they're abundant on Earth, but now we know them to be on Mars as well. An energy source. Now, energy sources come in many different forms, and they're also abundant on Earth. But this energy source on Mars could have been something like methane. And a liquid source. Now, although a liquid source we know is abundant on Earth, we don't know if it's present on Mars. All we have is evidence that it was present. Most of the water on Mars is in the form of ice. And unfortunately, when the ice begins to melt on Mars, it does a fancy little thing, turning straight into gas, which is a process called sublimation. Yes! Awesome! All right. So most of the evidence that we have for a current liquid source on Mars is sort of circumstantial. And so one example of this evidence is at the Hale crater. You see these dark streaks here on this slope suggest the presence of flowing brine. Now, whether that brine is currently there or has been there, we're not entirely sure. So why do we care so much about finding water on Mars, more specifically? Well, we know that on Earth, water is essential for life. But why? Well, water is considered to be a universal solvent. So most of the chemical reactions in your body require the presence of water because water is able to dissolve them. Also, water is less dense in its solid state. When it's in the form of ice, it floats on top of liquid water. And why is this important? Well, it keeps the temperature stable in aquatic environments when seasons change. Also, water helps cells maintain their shape. Now, the best example of this is plants. But of course, people are just plants with feelings, so it's close enough. So here's a picture of a turgid cell from a leaf that has enough water, so the plant is nice and stiff, the leaves are out, and the plant is able to get sunlight and everything else it needs. But when the cell becomes flaccid, the plant begins to wilt. And the similar thing sort of happens to our cells. And also, water helps carry nutrients to your cells and waste away from your cells. So water is very important for life on Earth. And it's sort of safe to assume that if we're going to look for something on another planet to find life, it's possible it could be water as well. Now I'm going to focus a little bit on the research that sort of broke the news about water on Mars. This group of scientists come from Italy. The first author of this paper, Dr. Orsi, you can see him here smiling in the middle, as he should be. They did great work. But we're going to go to Mars, to the South Polar Cap specifically, because that's where these guys were focusing their research. Now, this group used a technology called radio echo sounding, which is basically low-frequency radar waves. And what's cool about this is that these radar waves are capable of penetrating the surface of a planet and going all the way through to the bedrock and then bouncing back. And so this technology has successfully been used to find water under our polar ice sheets on Earth. So the way it really works is these guys equipped the Mars Express spacecraft with the stuff needed to generate these waves. If you want to look up more about it, it's called MARSIS, M-A-R-S-I-S. And so the MARSIS equipment is basically, it sends off these sound waves through to the surface of the planet where it hits the bedrock and reflects back at a certain level. But when these waves hit liquid underneath the surface, they reflect at a stronger level. So here's just an image of the South Polar Cap looking at it straight on. And this little black square is where these guys actually found some interesting data. Now this image here is called a radargram. And the way you can read a radargram is each dot represents a spot that the radio echo sounding waves were emitted to and bounced back. When the dots are black or beige, it indicates that these waves hit bedrock. But when the dots are dark blue, it suggests that these waves hit liquid. And so it's very clear that in this sampling area of the radargram, this little triangle here suggests the presence of a lake. And to be more specific, this lake could be about 12 miles wide, which is a pretty prominent feature as well. Now, using fancy math that I don't understand because I'm not a physicist, they found that this potential lake could be less than a mile beneath the surface of Mars. So this is kind of exciting because theoretically it could be realistic for us to drill down into this area and see if there might actually be liquid there in future Mars missions. But a more important question that these scientists asked themselves was, how could there be liquid on Mars? Some facts about Mars include that the atmosphere is 96% CO2, it's very dry and arid, and although the temperature can be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit at the equator, it can reach negative 195 degrees Fahrenheit at the poles, which is where this lake is located. Well, there's a couple ways to keep liquid from freezing under very cold temperatures. One way is by putting it under an immense amount of pressure. And although there could be enough pressure from the polar cap above this lake alone, it's more likely that this lake has a lot of salt. And so rather than being liquid water, it could be more of a briny lake. And so the news sort of took this and ran away with it, right? They said, oh, they found water on Mars, how exciting. Now, this is really exciting, not to understate it at all, but now scientists are suggesting there could even be oxygen in this water, and now they're suggesting that there could be life in it. Well, what kind of life would it be? Well, I'm just going to beat you to it. Aliens. Anything on Earth. Anything that's not on Earth is an alien, okay?
All right.
But what kind of aliens could they be? Are you thinking these wonderful, cuddly little critters that just want kisses from you? Or are you thinking something more like this, like a microbe? Well, I'm going to take us to Earth, to Antarctica. In the McMurdo Dry Valleys, there's a lake called Lake Vita. And what's important about Lake Vita is that it's completely sealed in ice year-round. The temperature can be below -10 degrees Celsius, and the salinity is 7 times that of seawater, so it is a brine. Here is Lake Vita, and you can see this ice sheet that's on top of it. And this little tiny X right here in the middle is where we're going to check out what these researchers did. So this is Dr. Allison Murray, who was one of the major players in this study where they actually showed that microbes could survive in the brine of Lake Vita. Now, you see these guys here, these are also researchers basically collecting a sample of the brine of Lake Vita. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at what kind of room they're working in. So the room they're working in is what we microbiologists call a clean room environment. And what's great about this is that it keeps anything that you might bring in on yourself, because of course we're covered in microbes, from contaminating your samples. So anything that they see in this brine is likely actually from the brine and not from, say, their nose or their fingernails or anything like that. Now, one of the first things scientists like to do when they obtain new samples is look at it, right? Well, the tool that microbiologists really enjoy using is microscopy to look at things. And one of the common techniques used to look at microbes that you may not know their identity is scanning electron microscopy. And the way it works is an electron gun generates electrons that are then concentrated into a beam through an anode. This beam of electrons then travels through the tube to where it hits the sample. These electrons bounce off the sample where they're read by the electron detector. And what this electron detector does is it converts every electron that it sees into a pixel of an image until you see it's in your sample. So here's just an example of some E. coli under a scanning electron microscope. And you can see the texture of the bacteria as well as this sticky stuff. Now, when the researchers looked at the sample from Lake Vita, they saw organisms of many sizes. So you can see some very small ones here, some that are of like a moderate size, and then even a very large one. And what they also observed was that these organisms had sort of this sticky substance coming off of them or sticking between them. And what that substance might be is called an extrapolymeric substance, which is just a fancy way of saying that microbes also make stuff like snot. So, most importantly, one of the things that these scientists asked themselves was, what kind of microorganisms could these possibly be if they're capable of surviving in the dark, these cold, these salty environment? How is that possible? Well, that would be through extremophiles. So extremophiles are actually one of my favorite types of microbes. And here, he doesn't actually have a mohawk or a skateboard, but this is my favorite extremophile called the tardigrade or the water bear. And he's been breaking the news lately too because he can survive in space without a spacesuit. So there are many different types of extremophiles, so I'll just focus on the kinds that could be in Lake Vita, and these could also be on Mars as well. But they could be psychrophiles, which love the cold. They could be halophiles, which love salt. And sometimes extremophiles can be a little bit of both. So why do we care so much about extremophiles, though? They're not necessarily pathogenic to humans in general, considering people don't like to go into volcanoes or briny lakes in Antarctica. But one thing that's important about extremophiles is that we can learn a lot from them. So here you can see a hot spring in Yellowstone National Park. And there's a certain little bacteria in there, or a certain little microbe in there called Thermus aquaticus. And he's able to survive at very high temperatures, meaning his enzymes can continue to work at high temperatures. So later on tonight, Erica is going to actually talk about some of the uses we've gotten out of this guy. So be sure to hang around. But in the meantime, to summarize my talk, what did they find on Mars? They found radar evidence of water. So they didn't actually find water, but it doesn't mean it's any less exciting because now we know where to really look. Now we know that it's possible that although water may not be on the surface of Mars, it may be beneath the surface. So we're not looking deep enough. And what kind of life could Mars sustain? Well, I don't know about sponges being in that brine under the surface of Mars, but it's possible they could be similar to the extremophiles you find on Earth, which is still pretty interesting. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge Science Matters Shreveport for letting me give you this talk today. I hope you found it entertaining and informative. And also Red River Brewing Company for letting us have a place to do this exciting event. And if you want more science, follow me on Twitter, either at Cole McNasty, which is my personal account. It's also my gamer tag. Feel free to add me on Xbox. Our department also has a really cool Twitter account called MicroImmuno. It's way more professional than my personal one, but hey. And with that, be sure to 20% of proceeds tonight go towards activities like ideas. So be sure to get your beer and mention Science Matters. So thank you. Yes.
So recently they sent something to Mars like 2 days ago. That was on the news. Is that related? The same group of people? Do you know what it's supposed to be doing?
So that's the Mars InSight spacecraft, which it's actually in a completely different part of Mars. I can't remember what the name of the place is, but it's going to be sampling the soil as well as the air, and yeah. Yes?
I can speak to that a little bit. It's
Okay.
Measuring seismic activity,
Yes.
Marsquakes. It landed on what's reported to be the most boring part of Mars because it just wanted the landing to go while they were looking under the surface. Among other things, they have, for want of a better word, a robotic gopher that's digging down into this about, I forget what it is, 9 or 15 meters beneath the
It's
surface.
not that far though, yeah.
Yeah,
Not very far.
to measure thermal activity.
And I seem to remember that they had something where they had objects that could ever be deployed while they were landing that could give telemetry.
Right.
So they could actually measure kind of triangulate locations.
They can actually watch it land.
Yeah, rather than just be like, well, we hope to God it landed.
But they did,
crash.
yeah, it did. They were able to see it, so.
Yeah. I thought that was kind of interesting that they actually were interested in trying to actually triangulate and see where things land.
Yeah.
And actually, like, instead of being like, well, we just spent like all these millions of dollars sending this one
So
rover
let's
that
wait
may
for
or
the
may not land.
selfie.
Yeah.
Any more questions? We got one. All right, Sam.
Mommy. Mommy,
So
say
we're going
hi.
to have
I'm gonna go to the back, okay?
about a 10 to 15
gonna
minute
come.
interval between the talks that you guys